Great. So thanks to MWA for working with us to present this topic to you all today. And thank you for joining and listening. This is JPA Tips for Advanced MiEnviro users with a particular focus on stream and wetland projects. My name is Kate Kirkpatrick. I am the Wetlands Policy Analyst in the Wetlands, Lakes, and Streams Unit with EGLE. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. So yes, this is advanced MiEnviro users. It is assuming that those listening in today are pretty familiar with a lot of the permit review criteria concepts, but I will be pointing out some other helpful webinars that are available online if you'd like more information or a refresher on some things. This presentation is mostly evaluating some of the more common issues or questions that we get regarding complicated stream and wetland files and how to present those in the permit application for EGLE staff to best understand. So I'll start off with the very briefest of introductions on our program and the JPA and why we require certain information. But the bulk of this presentation is going to be looking closer at specific problem sections. We'll be looking more at the permit category section, project description, resource impacts, specifically separating 301 and 303 impacts, impact type, activity type for structures, utilities, the impact tables, site plans, and then we'll end with some reminders on best practices and how best to utilize the pre-application meetings. So I do expect this to take almost the full amount of time we have set aside for today, but any questions we'll try to get to throughout the presentation. So first, I want to give a little reminder on the background of the joint permit application and our Section 404 program. Michigan is special in that it has a consolidated permitting program at the land and water interface and has assumed Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. So Michigan is one of only 2 states that's been approved by the federal government to administer Section 404, along with New Jersey. The Michigan legislature drafted Part 303 specifically to allow the state to assume the program. And the U.S. EPA is responsible for oversight of Michigan's administration of the 404 program, so it can ensure that our program is operated in a manner that is consistent with federal law. We've also worked with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to develop a joint permit application process so that only one application is needed in areas where an EGLE and Army Corps permit are both needed, which would be in those coastal areas and designated navigable rivers that are covered by Section 10 of the Federal Rivers and Harbors Act. And this slide shows the timeline of how we created this program, starting in 1972 with the Michigan's Inland Lakes and Streams Act, and then the signing of MOAs between Michigan, EGLE, and the Army Corps, and finally with the assumption of Michigan's own regulatory program in 1984. Part 13 of NREPA, our state statute, is the part of statute that pertains to our permits and does apply to pretty much all of our resource program statutes. So all of our major statutes and a few more are affected by the language in Part 13, and the JPA includes most of these statutes in it. Part 13 also requires us to coordinate how the applications are processed under all the statutes in Part 13, which again is pretty much all of our resource program statutes. An important part of Part 13 and assumption of our program is reporting. So every year we have to submit a report to the legislature, and that includes how many applications were received, how many were denied, how long it took for those applications to be marked complete, how long the processing deadlines were on average, how many were not complete when we received them, and then the amount of money refunded if we went past our deadlines. But we also have to report specific data to federal agencies in order to maintain our program. So those reports are always available on our website, but we are required to provide a report on the following: the number and nature of individual permits, GPs, and MPs issued, modified, or denied, the number and nature of actual and suspected violations and enforcement actions taken, requested and permitted permanent and temporary conversion impacts to inland lakes, streams, and wetlands in linear feet or acres of impact, acres of wetland restoration, mitigation, and preservation as mitigation, and linear feet of stream mitigation, assessment of the cumulative impact of the state's permit program on the integrity of state-regulated waters, and a summary of changes to the program or procedures. So the JPA gathers this kind of information, and Eagle staff are required to complete accurate, what we call program components forms with each application that is then used to provide these overviews for Lansing Central to complete the reports. The digital JPA ensures that the basic information is completed, which helps a lot with reporting. It requires the applicant to complete certain questions in order to even be able to submit the application. However, it is still Eagle staff responsibility to check those answers and make sure they're done correctly and completely, ultimately ensuring that we have the information we need to be able to public notice a project and provide accurate reporting information. Throughout the entire JPA, there are information bubbles to help applicants understand how to answer the questions and what information to provide. The info bubbles will also refer to specific links to help applicants find additional clarification. And there are links within the instructions at the beginning of the application as well. The JPA does have a lot of sections and questions, but it's been designed to go through a logical sequence and help applicants understand what is being asked for by providing descriptions and pop-up informational bubbles. For example, on the far left of the screen is the start of the sections that appear in the JPA. So this is essentially your baseline application. And then as you select resource or activity types, it will add sections for you to complete associated questions with each of those resource or activity types. This is the logical nature of the JPA, and there are many ways it does this all throughout the application. But these are the different resource sections that will appear if you select each one of the resources. And then these are all the separate project activity sections that will appear with additional required answers to answer for each of those sections. For the purposes of this presentation, these are the sections that we're going to be focusing on today. All the red you see is what happens when questions aren't answered. This is a screenshot of the application on the public-facing side, the applicant side, and what happens when someone tries to skip a question. So it will highlight it red, and then additional information pops up that is intended to help the applicant better understand what is required for the question. Here is a screenshot of a section in the JPA where document submission is optional per the rules of the form, but it might still be information that is needed. And so there are a lot of areas of the JPA that can easily be avoided or incorrectly answered. These optional questions are opportunities for applicants to provide additional information or attachments as needed. Providing information in these optional questions can often help in our review process, sometimes making the review easier or quicker. For example, a question asking for the permit number under which previous dredging was authorized is optional because applicants may not always have this information. However, if you do have it, when it is provided, our staff are able to quickly and easily look back at the previous application and permit, which can definitely be helpful in the review process and may be necessary for important background on the site. The JPA administrative review checklist can really help applicants understand what we need. This presentation today is really building on all of the information provided in the administrative completeness webinar that we did earlier this year. So definitely please check that out. We are going to dive into specific issues and tips on providing information for more complicated wetland and stream projects in the JPA. But I do want to note for everybody that all of the following are general tips that are based on Eagle staff suggestions on how items should be processed. Some of these tips are not necessarily Eagle requirements, although if there are, I will make sure to clearly state which are requirements and which items Eagle is noting as a tip. So I'm going to highlight common issues and consultant questions of the JPA from start to finish. So the first most common issue, and one that really sets up the rest of the application, is the permit category. The permit category section is where the applicant must select all of the relevant GP or MP categories for the project activities, unless it's for an individual public notice project. Since we're talking about more complicated stream or wetland projects, most of what you're dealing with will likely fall under the public notice individual permit selection. However, this does still seem to be a common correction request section, because if the applicant has applied under a GP or an MP or multiple GPs or MPs or both, and there are aspects of the project that do not meet the conditions laid out by that category, Eagle staff will send a correction request. If it seems like there's a minor tweak to the project that will allow the applicant to apply under an MP or GP, Eagle staff will notify you of that and provide you with options on how to move forward and address that. There is an option in this section of the JPA to select unsure, which you are welcome to utilize. It just means that a correction request will definitely be sent for that item, and Eagle staff will notify you of potential categories you could apply under and how to move forward. Utilizing the permit categories, even for projects that must be applied under a public notice project, is pretty key for ensuring a smoother permit process. So I really want you to consider the GPs and the MPs as your guidebook. The GPs and the MPs are essentially your feasible and prudent alternatives for specific project activities. So it is in the best interest of the applicant to try and design projects to meet the conditions of the categories. I highly recommend breaking down each regulated activity that needs a permit in terms of its associated GP or MP category, if it has one. So in this example, we have a business expansion project that is proposing 2 culvert crossings, a stormwater outlet, and fill to accommodate the building construction. Next, we want to determine what resources are proposed to be impacted by each activity. The culvert crossings, let's say, are within regulated streams and regulated floodplains, so that's part 301 and part 31. The stormwater outlet is being constructed to outlet to wetland, so let's say that's part 303. And the fill is being proposed in wetland under part 303 as well. Next, we're going to look at all the GP and MP categories and see where those activities might fit. For the GP and MP, I highlighted in dark blue the categories that might apply to the culvert crossings. So clear span bridge, culverts small, culverts wetland equalizer, culverts large. The stormwater outlet in green might fit under outlet structures in MP 36, or maybe stormwater outfall structures for MP 50. The fill, we have a minor fills MP 21. So maybe the project is able to fit under that one. And from a consultant's perspective, I'm going to make a note to take a closer look at each of those conditions. So we are going to take a closer look at each of those categories and determine if it applies for the right statute. So at the top of each category, you'll see the checked boxes for which statutes the following conditions can apply to. There will also be a basic condition at the beginning that provides you with some general conditions, and then a bulleted list of more specific requirements that the project must meet in order to be considered under that category. So for this example, let's say we're looking at our 2 culvert crossings, and each culvert crossing is within regulated stream and regulated floodplain, not wetland. So we can continue with this category. Both are new crossings that are 6 feet in diameter and 25 feet long, and we've gone through and ensured that it was designed in a way to meet each of these conditions, so we know that it meets this category. I have seen some agents, which I do think can be helpful, provide an actual checklist of each activity and the category that they're applying under as sort of a way to show their work that they've considered each of these items. So, that's not a requirement, but I do think that this is an exercise that can definitely help keep things organized. Now, let's say that one of your culverts is not meeting the identified bankful width, which is a requirement of the culvert category. So let's say that bankful is 6 feet, but you are proposing a 5-foot diameter culvert. And so you know immediately that the project won't fit a GP or MP category, and you're just applying under an individual public notice permit. I will say this is something that would be an immediate flag to Eagle staff because undersizing culverts is not a best management practice and would be a difficult permit to process under our statutory review criteria. And the GP and MP categories were developed to include important best management practices that allow us to expedite our review. So if that's not being utilized, you are going to be adding time to your processing review. So instead of immediately applying under the individual permit because you instantly don't meet the category, instead consider modifying your project design to meet the category. In this way, you are showing that you are utilizing the least impactful alternative and avoiding and minimizing impacts to the greatest extent by incorporating a best management practice. And this is an exercise that really should be done for every activity within the proposed project, even if your project as a whole has to be applied as a public notice project. For example, let's say that your project meets MPGP categories for the culverts and the stormwater outlet, but not for the fill. So you're still applying under the individual permit process. It is very helpful for Eagle staff to know that the culverts and stormwater outlets are still meeting MPGP category conditions. So I would recommend explicitly stating that in your narrative descriptions. Tell us how most of your activities are meeting best management practices and GP or MP categories, even if you can't apply under them for the entire project, because that is something that ultimately is important for your alternatives analysis. And then as for the fill component that doesn't meet the MP, you should still look to the category to see where you can address best management practices. Again, using the categories as a sort of guide for what is considered minimal or what methods are preferred, and then provide an alternatives analysis that addresses why it can't be minimized and meet that category. Okay, moving on to common issue number 2, which is the project description section. So this is also a really important part of your application. This is where you'll be setting up the project to Eagle staff and getting at why you're applying for a permit. The applicant should be selecting all relevant options that best describes the purpose and need for the project. If you're selecting other, it is helpful if you sort of over-explain the project activities in terms of methods, impacts, purpose. Other for project type is often used for things like stream restoration project. It's used for boardwalks, wetland drainage, etc. This section is where you'll find the narrative questions that summarize the project and the proposed activities. So you should be providing a description of the entire project, including activities directly impacting regulated features like dredge, fill, structures, drainage, and indirectly impacting regulated features like overland runoff, for example. Phase projects like future development projects or subdivisions must be sufficiently described or shown on site plans, and a timeline should be provided for those phases. Because of state and federal regulations, staff may have to require phase projects be applied under one permit application. The project purpose has to include all associated activities and shall not so narrowly define the purpose as to limit a complete feasible and prudent alternatives analysis. A schedule of the proposed activities must be provided. Schedules must include construction timing, methods, equipment being used, soil erosion and sedimentation control measures, estimate of project start and completion date. So everything listed on this slide is on the administrative completeness checklist, and it's also stated in the JPA. So these are required items that you do have to provide in this section. But some of your projects are very complicated to explain in the JPA. It might be very large, it might have complicated funding or several partners, or be a long-term project, or have a crazy complicated site history. So because of this, and because you only get so much character space in the JPA, some applicants do choose to submit a separate document for this, which is fine as long as you indicate that in this section. I would still recommend providing the basic overview of project impacts directly in the JPA, like this consultant did. In this example, it's a complicated stream restoration, dam removal file, multi-year project. They did provide the summary of activities with all involved regulated resources, but at the end, they told us to look at the attached full description of the project. They told us where to find it and where to find history, environmental impacts, purpose and need, and the proposed project. This is a good example of providing Eagle with the overall project information and essentially confirms the end result of proposed impacts. So it starts with the intended use and reason for the project. Definitely don't skip that. It is a requirement of the JPA, especially for Part 303 permit review criteria. And then it simply breaks down the impact types and resource types, which I'll go into more detail in a bit. They tell us the overall number of structures in each resource type, the total amount of temporary and permanent impacts for each resource type. And then at the bottom there, this is also incredibly helpful, is briefly explaining whether the project is meeting any exemptions and why. Exemptions are not something that require a permit, so we don't want these details isolated in the impact tables of the JPA, but exemption activities are often typically included in construction plans that are not Eagle specific. They can be mistaken as a regulated activity on the site plan, so these can be confusing for Eagle staff to review for completeness unless the applicant provides a clear explanation. So I would say exempt activities often result in a lot of correction requests because the application package either isn't forthcoming about that information or it's not clearly described, and there's not really a good place to supply that in the JPA for good reason. Next common issue is for resource type. So this is when staff are evaluating whether or not regulatory status of all resources have been verified and whether the applicant has appropriately considered all other regulated resources within the project activities. This is another section that depends on the logic of the JPA. So if this is filled out incorrectly, it will not generate the appropriate sections. With complicated projects, the issues stemming from this section is often a result of confusion or disagreement on how overlapping resources should be accounted for in the JPA. So the next few slides, I'll provide some general information on how Eagle wants to see these impacts separated. However, please note that for any of these projects, it might be site specific, and I'd always recommend a pre-application meeting for complicated projects to discuss these specific items for the application. But starting with largely stream projects, we're talking about streams that meet the regulatory definition of a stream. So if there is a question on whether or not it meets the definition of a stream, you should be bringing in Eagle staff early on through on-site pre-application meetings to make those calls ahead of time in order to keep the process running smoothly. In general, unless significant, emergent vegetation below the ordinary high water mark of a Part 301 regulated stream does not need to be included as a wetland impact. There are some caveats to this. If we have a large stream wetland complex or maybe an overwidened channel, that may not be the case, and it may be a situation we need to make the call together on site. Impacts to wetlands extending onto shallow sloping banks or onto floodplain benches should be included as a wetland impact. But whether that impact is temporary or not depends on the type of activity and whether it's incorporating best management practices or other minimization of impacts. But as you can see, this is why accurately identifying the ordinary high water mark is pretty important for these files, and determining our regulatory boundaries is important. The JPA does ask for this information, including elevation data and how that data was collected. I do want to note here that we are aware that different consultants and consulting companies will provide the ordinary high water mark information in different ways. For lawn stream projects in particular, it is common to either get the ordinary high water mark as a single elevation point taken in the field, typically at the center of the project, or we'll also get depth measurements in feet from the stream bottom that applies to the entire length of the project. I'd say as long as it's consistent throughout the application and the site plans, and as long as it's clear, that's the most important thing. We do want this information in the application, but it's probably most critical on the site plans when necessary. So if it's tricky, providing pictures, providing methods, your location of measurements taken in the application, those are also very helpful additional information to include on those tricky stream projects. Ponds are almost always wetlands. They tend to meet the statutory definition of a wetland. Whether they are regulated or not, based on the contiguous definition or exemptions, is something that we may need to confirm or discuss through the pre-application meeting. But if it is regulated, it is something that should be counted as a Part 303 wetland impact and shown on site plans as a wetland pond. In general, dredging a regulated pond that does not meet exemptions is going to be considered a permanent wetland impact. If the pond is in line with a stream or near another regulated water body like a stream or a lake, then there might be other activities that need a permit under Part 301. Regulated activities under Part 301 says to construct, dredge, commence, extend, or enlarge an artificial canal, channel, ditch, lagoon, pond, lake, or similar waterway for connection to an existing lake or stream, or where any part of the artificial waterway is located within 500 feet of the ordinary high water mark of an existing inland lake or stream. So that is something that needs a permit through EGLE. So as an example, if there was dredging proposed with a regulated wetland pond within 500 feet of a stream, we would need to see the total impact area of the dredge accounted for as wetland in the JPA under Part 303, and also the excavation activity as it relates to the stream in the JPA under Part 301. So continuing with that example, in the JPA, you would select both wetland and stream, and there is an option to select pond as the resources being impacted by the project. So you would select all three of those. You would complete the additional questions that appear once you select pond. And in this case, I would select pond located within 500 feet of a lake or stream as part of my example. As far as the impacts go, you would provide the impact total in the wetland section. And depending on your project purpose, you would select the proper activity within the wetland section. So in this case, I've selected pond excavation creation to show the appropriate impact table and associated pond questions that will appear under the wetland section. Only select stormwater basin or sediment basin if it is an existing wetland feature on the landscape and you're proposing a new use or continued water treatment use of the wetland for either of these. If you're proposing new excavation in upland to create a treatment basin, then it might just need to be regulated as a 301 activity for excavation within 500 feet of stream. Essentially, any excavation that's going to hold water or excavate below the water table within 500 feet of a lake or stream needs a permit. But in this example, for a pond and wetland, for the stream section outlined in blue, you would describe the impact as a zero impact project because you've already accounted for it in the wetland section. You would still have to provide basic information on the stream, but the JPA does allow you to skip or say unsure on questions on ordinary high watermark, bankful, etc., because in this case, the project activity that's just being regulated is the construction within 500 feet of the stream. And so to make it clear to Eagle staff, and what I've done in this example is I am including the excavation as an other activity, and then I'm describing it as an excavation of a pond 450 feet from unnamed creek. And then I would put zeros in the table to show that it's not proposed to impact the creek directly. Lakes and riparian wetland can be tricky to separate impacts, but in general, significant riparian wetland along lake shorelines must be included in the impact area under Part 303, which is a very common occurrence on lakes. Impacts can be separated by areas with extensive emergent stemmed or floating leaf vegetation in normal, untreated conditions and open water. Keto Geikis with Wetland Lakes and Streams Unit does have a great video on MWA's YouTube page for Eagle jurisdictional determination of wetlands, which has some good reminders on regulating features, what we consider open water, etc. Definitely check that out. Okay, moving right along to common issue number 4, impact type. This is especially a common issue with complicated projects that have a lot of different impacts to different resources. So there are several different places this comes up throughout the JPA. And we've already touched on providing sort of the breakdown of impacts in the narrative portion, but there are also areas to provide the overall quantities within the wetland and stream sections of the JPA. Eagle does need to see the final amounts of temporary and permanent impacts separated out for review purposes, and this is also necessary for our reporting to EPA. So it is important that we have accurate numbers. Sometimes applicants struggle with the separation for the more complicated projects, so I am going to walk through what we mean when we say temporary versus permanent impacts. When we refer to temporary activities, we mean minor disturbance and that the ground, wetland, or stream is being restored following construction activities in kind and in place. By restored, we mean that we're going to see the same vegetation, the same grade, same resource type that was there previously. These can include projects like boreholes, open trenching, access roads, or clear span bridges that are immediately removed and reseeded or replanted. Timber matting through wetland can be a temporary impact that needs a permit if conditions are such that you're not able to meet the BMPs and the activities would result in dredge or fill. If you're not sure if something would be considered a temporary impact because the scope is very large or maybe the timing is longer than a construction season, definitely please discuss these with Eagle staff prior to submitting a permit application. Permanent impacts are when you are taking a resource like a wetland or stream and removing or changing its functions longer term. This can be when wetland is being removed and replaced with upland or a structure. It can also include draining a wetland, which can be something that gets missed in permit applications. Common examples in wetlands are fill or structure installations such as culverts, buildings, substations, roads, etc. For streams, that could be activities like shoreline protection, culverts, constructed riffles, veins, sediment removal or dredging. Adding man-made structures, even if it's for improvement of function, is considered a permanent impact. Another type of permanent impact is to construct, operate, or maintain a use in wetland. An example of this is permanently maintaining a utility corridor and therefore converting wetland from one type to another type, usually from forested to scrub shrub, or forested to emergent, or scrub shrub to emergent. Converting a wetland to open water is also a permanent impact. Utilizing wetland for stormwater treatment and storage is a use and permanent impact, so that needs to be accurately represented in the application. If you are talking about forested conversion in your application, you're not able to meet an exemption, a GP, or an MP category. So we are going to be asking for detailed information on those activities, including a wetland delineation and an accurate explanation of the impacts. Foreseeable secondary impacts, which are considered effects that are associated with the project, but not the direct result of the dredge, fill, drainage, use, or development activity, those do need to be included in the application. Under state and federal regulations, the applicant must provide a comprehensive analysis of the project that shows avoidance and minimization of all impacts from the project, including temporary, permanent, secondary, and cumulative impacts. Some common examples include cutting off surface water flow or water inputs to wetlands. It could also include subdivision development projects in wetland where there are wetlands within the residential lot lines that will be impacted in the future from home building or lawn or yard maintenance, etc. Water budget information or other data may be needed in some cases where the wetland hydrology is being impacted. And in some cases, secondary impacts may require wetland mitigation. For larger projects, don't forget to also include an analysis of cumulative impacts. This analysis, including a summary of secondary impacts, can be done in the narrative portion of the JPA within your feasible and prudent alternatives analysis. So this can be complicated, so you may want to discuss this with the Eagle permit processor or during a pre-application meeting on whether a secondary impact would be considered permanent or temporary. Ian Garwood did a presentation on evaluating feasible and prudent alternatives. That's also on the MWA YouTube page. So please check that out for other ideas on what to include and consider in your feasible and prudent alternatives analysis. So as I mentioned before, conversion impacts are considered permanent impacts for the purposes of the JPA and for mitigation. For mitigation, we allow different ratios for conversion impacts, so you would need to separate out those impacts from the total permanent impact amount. And I recommend doing that all throughout your application. So do that in your narrative description, have it separated on your site plans, and then you would be required to do it in your mitigation details section. So I have an example here on the screen of where I've got conversion in the first row, and then permanent wetland 1 in the second row with the different ratios associated with them. Okay, let's switch focus to streams for a second. While the ordinary high water mark is super important for determining that regulatory line, bank full width is really important for determining feasible and prudent alternatives, particularly for projects that are proposing in-stream structures, including culverts, or stream restoration and channel design projects. So for streams, applicants must provide bankful estimates for all watercourses within the project scope. Eagle staff will review this information to determine whether the project is avoiding and minimizing impacts, and also whether it's meeting necessary GP/MP project considerations. District staff will also, if necessary, loop in the stream restoration coordinator for review on those more complicated proposed project design. So Bankful may need to be verified for completeness, and pictures can definitely help with this, but the applicant should be providing basic information on how Bankful was determined, whether that was in the field, using regional reference curves, or both, using calculations. So the JPA is being updated soon to provide guidance and a specific place to answer those Bankful questions. Just a reminder that when providing bankful measurements, there is an order of preference on how bankful should be determined, and these can be found in our permit category documents. But the order of preference is essentially first on-site field indicators, second regional reference curves, and then third calculations using the 1.5-year flow. But any specific questions on ordinary high watermark or bankful, I would encourage you to look to our other trainings first. The bankful training webinar was just done this past fall and does a really good thorough examination on how those indicators should be determined in the field and what to do if those indicators are not there. So check those out too. Okay, common issue number 5, activity type. So this is an important section of the JPA again, because it's also part of the logic of the JPA. If the applicant has incorrectly or not selected an activity that should have been selected, the JPA will not generate the correct sections. So all of the relevant activity types should have been selected, and if there isn't one that accurately describes it, then other activity type can be selected, and it's on the applicant to adequately explain those impacts. So this section of the JPA is where you'll find the tables. And in general, the table's activity description, so the first column, should correspond exactly to the site plans so that Eagle staff can cross-check this information. We understand that the numbers may not match exactly for irregular areas in particular, but that's why there's a way to provide the corrected values. But please ensure that the identifiers, the activity IDs, are the same. I highly recommend, before filling out the tables, organizing your impacts prior to completing the tables in the following way. So impacts essentially need to be separated out by 3 important items. First is your resource type. So whether it's a wetland, a stream, floodplain, etc. And if it's in wetland, you may also need to separate it out even further by wetland type, whether that's forested, emergent, scrub shrub, rare and imperiled. Second, you should be separating out by impact types, permanent or temporary. And wetland impacts, again, may need to be separated out even further by conversion or secondary impacts. Finally, the impacts should be separated by activity type, which is in the JPA as structure, fill, excavation, utility. If there are multiple activities in the same resource and or multiple resources, I really recommend providing that impact with a specific ID, a specific identifier that helps clarify that information and makes it easy to find on plans. For example, this consultant had impacts for a large wind farm project that included impacts to wetlands, streams, access drives, it had crane walks, intersection improvements, collection lines, permanent and temporary. So what they did was they provided impact details using this unique identifier that highlighted all of that information. And they also provided this little legend on site plans that helped explain it. This is definitely a more complicated naming convention. There are certainly simpler ways you could name your impacts or activities, but this is at least one example where it is very unique and it was explained well in the context of the project, which had hundreds and hundreds of different impacts to keep track of. Particularly with structures, some structures are not as straightforward to include in the JPA because the impacts are overlapping with another activity or structure, or they include multiple resources or both. So to the best of your abilities, each structure should be included individually in the application. The JPA does instruct you to add more sections when there are multiple structures, and for the most part, that is what we want you to do. Again, the best way to denote these structures in the JPA is to give each one its own unique identifier that matches exactly with its position on the site plans and the cross sections. A lot of Eagle staff will put in CRs regarding structures because there's confusion on how they relate to the site plans. A lot of these more complicated projects, like transportation projects, often propose multiple structures, like culverts, in several different streams. The JPA really wants you to identify each structure as it relates to each stream. So you will need to generate multiple stream project information sections if you have different streams, and then also generate new impact sections to coordinate with each of the streams. So my screenshots are, in this example, are showing 3 different streams. So you have 3 different stream project information sections, and then 3 different stream impact sections to go with each of the streams. Now, the stream impact section, it doesn't have a great spot for you to say, all of these impacts are for tributary 1, and all of the impacts in this second section are for Coldwater Creek. So that is also where it's very helpful if you're naming your impacts in a way that directly connects it to the structure and the resource type. For example, you could say Coldwater Creek Culvert 1, Coldwater Creek Culvert 2, Huron Tributary Culvert 1, and Huron Tributary Outfall 1. So make it very clear where that structure belongs. For culverts in particular, if you select culverts as a project activity or bridge, the JPA will create a section just for providing more details on the culverts. And this is a particularly important section for transportation projects, large culvert installation, but really any project that's potentially going to be impacting the hydraulic capabilities of a stream. The JPA does want you to add a new section for each structure. So again, you need to be providing a name for that culvert, which clearly identifies which culvert, which location, which resource, Coldwater Creek 1, Coldwater Creek 2. I will talk about providing separate tables in a few slides, but if you just have a couple or a few culverts, this is how you should be completing the JPA for culverts or bridges. The section is not directly tied to the JPA. To the structure's impact sections. So whatever numbers you put in these bridges and culvert sections is not going to be affecting the numbers you put in the impact sections. The bridges and culvert section is intended to be a lot more detailed, whereas the stream impact section is very simply length, width, depth below the ordinary high water mark, and it totals the numbers for you. The bridges and culvert section is getting at how you design the structure and whether that structure is designed appropriately for the existing channel. So this is an important section to complete. Yes, some of the questions will feel repetitive, but it provides us with the necessary information to be able to confirm that these structures are meeting best management practices and are not going to be causing negative impacts upstream or downstream. For structures that may have different activities associated with them, like equalization culverts that have fill or riprap associated with them, the JPA really only needs you to separate out the impacts by fill type and structure. There may be excavation necessary to install the structure, but the JPA does instruct the applicant to only include the impact in the structure table if the impact is primarily a structure and your net impact is going to be a structure or fill. So in this example, we have one driveway going through wetland A with one wetland equalizer culvert that has riprap on both ends in wetland A. I'm going to select driveway and riprap as my 2 fill activities, and provide a clear identifier for each of those impacts in the table. So I have driveway 1A, riprap 1A, riprap 2A. I'm going to say none of the above for my excavation and dredge activities because that's what the JPA instructs me to do. And then I'm going to include my unique structure ID and include that information specific to what is within wetland in my structure table. So in this example, I have equalizer culvert 1A to signify that it's an equalizer culvert 1 in wetland A. Okay, now I'm going to tie this in with utilities. So utility information, whether it's within the footprint of another activity or as a standalone impact, should be provided in the application by selecting it as an activity type. There are two options, one for below ground, one for above ground activities, so you should select the appropriate one. For utilities, the impact type might vary depending on what the end result is. For example, if a utility is being installed below ground, but the wetland is being restored above the utility to pre-existing conditions, we would consider that a temporary impact. But what if the activity is overlapping an impact area? For example, what if the utility is being installed below road fill? So all regulated activities still need to be included in the application. A good rule of thumb is if the JPA has that option as a selection in either the activity type or the resource impact type, then please select it and complete the section. There are a few different ways to help Eagle staff understand if activities are overlapping an impact area so as not to confuse the total numbers or double count impacts. So first, you can provide that information and an overall summary of the final impact numbers in the narrative sections to clarify the impacts. Second, you can make sure your activity name or identifier is unique and descriptive. For example, you could say utility boring 1 within driveway fill A or crossing A under impact 1. If the utility is being installed within the footprint of another activity, that impact area should be reflected by the predominant, or in other words, the net result. And you can then provide 0 impact numbers for the utility activity that's being encompassed by the fill or the driveway impact. So in this example on the screen, I have my driveway impact counted in its entirety in the fill table. And then I have my utility structure labeled electric utility under drive 1 with 0 impacts to show it's being encompassed by the drive 1 fill. You'll be able to provide the wetland crossing details, including length and diameter info for utilities within the separate utility section that ask those additional questions. So these impact and activity sections have other questions associated with them. So we don't want you to just skip them. But we do understand that there are sometimes nuanced impacts that need to be addressed differently in every application. So this is the common approach to addressing those overlapping impacts in the application. Conversion impacts are an important impact to provide information on in the application. Not providing enough details on these will often result in correction requests from Eagle staff. So I do recommend using the other activity section to separate out these impacts in particular. Other common examples of other activities might be boardwalks, wetland uses, or wetland drainage. So this is a good spot for that. The JPA at this point has been around for a little while, and we're in an age where technologies are evolving. So where we don't have a great spot for it in the JPA, that's definitely where you can use this other activities, other selection box and try to explain those impacts. Again, you should be using unique identifiers that correspond directly to the site plan, providing additional explanation in the narrative sections, and if necessary, you can provide corrected values for irregular areas. Okay, I do want to take a moment to talk about boardwalks and how that should be completed in these section because this does seem to come up a lot. Boardwalks would be an other project type, And within the narrative description, we're definitely wanting to know how impacts are being minimized by the type of methods, equipment, vegetation clearing, etc. The activity would then be other project type, and then under wetland impacts, the entire footprint of the boardwalk would be considered a permanent impact. If a stream crossing is proposed as part of a boardwalk project, it should be designed as a clear span bridge. And large boardwalks that do not meet the GP category for recreational pathways may require mitigation. In this boardwalk wetland impact example, let's just say this is a 640-foot long boardwalk that is 8 feet wide. So I've added 640 times 8 feet as my wetland impact total in acreage. Let's say 600 feet of emergent wetland and 40 feet of forested wetland to get approximately 0.12 acres of total permanent impact. We're going to say I have 0 temporary impacts because all impacts are contained to the boardwalk footprint. And I'm making sure to note that both emergent and forested wetland are to be impacted. There's no fill being brought in. This is primarily for a structure, so I'm going to say no excavation, but I do have to select boardwalk for my structure impact and wetland. With my structured table that shows up, I'm going to make it super clear to the Eagle permit processor how much impact is in forested wetland and how much is in emergent wetland. So I've separated those two resource types in the structure table by giving it a unique identifier, emergent boardwalk and forested boardwalk. And then I'm going to answer the remaining associated questions that come up when I select boardwalk, which asked me if the structure is on pilings or fill or both, and how high off the ground is the bottom of the structure. So with all of that being said, with all the table information I shared, in your preparation for the JPA, a lot of consultants do like to organize the impacts through a comprehensive table and then provide this as a separate attachment in the JPA. We especially see this if there are very large projects that have hundreds of structures or crossings. In those cases, I would absolutely recommend providing your own table over duplicating 100 structure sections in the JPA. But either way, if you're providing this information in the JPA using the tables in MiEnviro, then a separate table attachment is not required. But a lot of Eagle staff have told me that they do find this helpful and often prefer it for more complicated projects because it makes the review a little bit easier when that information is all in one place. If you are going to provide a table attachment, please still start the appropriate sections in the JPA so the correct sections appear with all the other required answers. So Eagle, it doesn't really matter how you show this in the JPA. You can either provide averages or totals in the table or just include a placeholder with 0 amounts that says see attached table 1. But the important thing with the tables is that you do need to provide the same minimal information in your attached table as the JPA tables. So include total volume in cubic yards, include total area in square feet and acreage, your total and average dimensions in linear feet, your width, your lengths, your depths. If you're going to provide a separate table for culverts in particular, then please include the same information as the bridges and culverts section in the JPA that we talked about earlier. So like we mentioned, that does have a lot more information in that section that asked for things like existing versus proposed elevations, existing and proposed culvert material information, upstream and downstream information, cross-sectional areas. So the culvert table attachment would need to be much more comprehensive. And then as far as impact tables in general, I like this example in particular because it does everything we just talked about. It separates out the impacts by resource type. This particular table is for stream impacts only, and you can see in their table where they note that the activities also have wetland impacts. So that crossing ID will also have a wetland impact line item on their separate wetland impact table. It also separates out the impacts by the activity type, access road or crane walk, whether that impact is temporary or permanent, and then the unique crossing ID that corresponds exactly with the site plans and cross sections. I also like this table because it provides the impact lengths in linear feet, impact areas below the ordinary high water mark, in acreage, total volumes in cubic yards, bankful numbers, riprap volumes, and then it breaks down all of the total numbers for everything from the entire project scope to individual stream totals. So very thorough, comprehensive table. A common question that I've gotten is why does Eagle need specific dimensions when total average area seems to be more relevant for permitting language? As I mentioned earlier, we do have specific reporting requirements for federal agencies. So that is why we ask for volumes in cubic yards and areas in acreage, stream projects and linear feet. But the dimensions of the impact is really also a way for us to confirm that the information matches with the site plans. And ultimately, we recognize that each project can have a lot of nuances and complicated impact information. So, we want the JPA to be broad enough that it covers a wide range of project types, but also specific enough that we can answer the basic questions, do our reporting requirements, confirm the impacts. So we just want to understand quickly and clearly what is happening based on the information that you provided, whether that's through the JPA, through separate attachments. You do need to complete the appropriate sections in the JPA and provide that basic information. But, to put it simply, as long as you can clearly explain X type of impact is proposed in Y resource and impacting Z amount permanently or temporarily, that's ultimately what we're trying to get to. So we want to make sure that it's clear for the public if we need to public notice it. We want to be able to clearly report on the impacts, and we want to be able to clearly write a permit for those impacts. Finally, the application is not complete without proper site plans. So in general, site plans need to clearly show the entire proposed project, all of the regulated resources, and all of the impacts proposed in those regulated resources. They should be clear and easy to understand and shouldn't be so cluttered with additional information that they're difficult to navigate or tease out the important information. The site plans are what we attach to the permit. So they need to match with the JPA as best as they can, but the site plans are ultimately what Eagle is providing a stamp of approval on. So if those are not updated and accurately reflecting the project to the level that we have modified or discussed during the processing period, that can be a problem. There are minimum site requirements for what we need to see on all site plans, and that is provided in the instructions and as a checklist in the JPA itself. It includes a scale, compass north, property lines, impact areas with associated amounts, resource boundaries, and associated ordinary high watermark. Don't forget bankful too on streams. Dimensions, topographic contour when applicable, which is typically for floodplain projects. So this list in the JPA does not include everything that needs to be on site plans, but they are definitely reminders of several items that are often missed. So depending on the project, the statutory criteria, and other reminders throughout the JPA, you may need to include longitudinal profiles that cover the entire length of the stream, easement boundary information that's clearly identified, individual utility crossing locations, etc. So everybody seems to do their site plan package a little different, and we want to try to be accommodating as much as possible, knowing that everybody does it a little differently. However, this is definitely the preferred complete package that makes it easiest on Eagle staff to quickly review. So some tips here: one file that includes all the necessary sheets of impacts, cross sections, impact tables. We do prefer reviewing a site plan package that's specifically geared towards Eagle permitting. We will accept construction or engineering plans, but they can be really confusing if they contain aspects of the project that extend beyond the Eagle permitting scope. They can be too cluttered because they can contain upland work or construction notes, and Eagle staff will read all of that and will have questions about that. And sometimes it can just result in more questions and confusion than is really necessary. So by just providing the plans that are specific to wetland, stream, floodplain, etc., and the information provided in the way that we need for the JPA, that makes it much easier to review. If you do have to make changes to the site plan, again, not a requirement, just a tip, it is much easier for Eagle staff to keep organized if the entire site plan package is revised and resubmitted as one package, as opposed to updating a single sheet at a time and uploading that one sheet. And then naming the files in a way that reflects the revisions, like version 1, version 2, or the date it was changed, is also helpful. And this is largely why this is just a behind the curtains look at what Eagle staff see on our end with your permit application submissions. We have our own generated document section, then the submission sections with each version that's been submitted and all the documents that have been submitted with that version. But as a whole, the documents are shown in a list with new next to it if it's a new document. There is pretty limited information associated with the document in this view. And when there are this many documents, it can take a while to find the information we're looking for, especially if we have 3 different versions of the site plans and 2 versions of sheet 5. So I would say one document for all the site plans and cross sections. And then if you need to revise, providing a complete updated site plan and cross-section document makes for quicker review. So this is something that I've seen some agents do, and I think this is the ideal site plan package. So include all in one document, a site location map as the first sheet, a site plan of the overall development on the next sheet, your wetland and stream impact plans, floodplain impact plans if necessary, stormwater plan that includes calculations showing first flush and pre-treatment information and any discharge points. And I'm going to go into more details on each one of these. So for your site location map, that should be your first page. A good site location map helps the public when things are public notice. It should provide the general project information, including the applicant, the agent, the date the plans were completed or revised. And we would recommend a large scale showing the project location within the county or city or township, and then a smaller scale showing the project location with major roads identified. I like this example. It's got the large scale and the smaller scale. It's got the applicant information, the date revised, engineer stamp. I like the sheet index. You can also see here that these are Eagle specific plans. These are not construction plans. It says not for construction on top. Your second sheet is your site plan of the overall development. This is your one-page snapshot of impacts that includes all resource boundaries and overall impact summary. This overall impacts map is super great because they made it very clear. They color-coded the impacts between collection lines and fill and wetland versus stream and temporary versus permanent with their own coding system. So wetland impacts are in green, stream is in purple, collection lines are red. It shows the participating easements in blue. It shows section boundaries and a detailed legend. They also have their existing versus proposed, and their impact names match their JPA. And they even had a table of lat-long coordinates of each of the impacts. Next can be your specific impact plans. This is where you'll want to highlight all the impacted wetland and stream areas, including cross-section locations and your labeled impact areas with their unique IDs. You should have a comprehensive legend that helps detail the plan existing versus proposed conditions, whether that's overlaid on an aerial or separate plans. Eagle staff generally prefer to see impacts overlaid on an aerial image, so we can quickly find this during our own aerial review. But this is also where you can include a table of impacts as well. So here's a great example of an impact summary table that was included in a recent plan set. Again, you've got impacts separated by resource type, activity type, and impact type, and with a descriptive, unique identifier. They have the basic information of impact area in square feet, acreage, net fill in cubic yards, linear feet totals for stream impacts, and then project totals that show the bottom line. This next set of plans, due to its scale, had really detailed yet easy to understand site plans. So for each crossing impact, they provided a location map. They provided a closer overall plan view of the impact. If it was in a stream flow profile view, a cross-section view that clearly stated which direction we're looking in, and a cross-section detail that provided details like ordinary high watermark, bank full, structure details, and dimensions. For their collection line plan set, they provided color-coded impacts on their plan view, resource boundary information, overlaid on an aerial image, and Eagle-specific notes that clarified which aspects of the project met exemptions, which did not, where Eagle District staff can find specific dimension information for other aspects of the project. So very, very detailed set of plans. And cross sections for each impact type and or structure must be provided. So we want all the measurements labeled clearly, including direction of view. Resource boundary information should also be on there. For stream channel alteration projects in particular, existing and proposed cross sections should be provided and fairly detailed. We're really trying to confirm bankful and proper channel sizing for these projects, so you might need to collect data from multiple cross sections if the bankful indicators are tricky, but yeah, cross sections are needed for each impact type. Typicals, so typical cross sections and profiles can be provided for similar structures and impact types and should include basic impact details. You can provide something like an impact range or refer to a table for specific dimension information if you want. In this directional drill collection line example, their cross sections show the wetland boundaries. They confirmed which impacts were outside of wetland boundaries. They showed the distance from the ground surface to the top of the line, and then the diameter typical of the line with notes that explained any differences or where line depths would vary from the typical. Here's some other typicals we often get for things like timber matting, pole installations, etc. Again, providing dimensions, volumes, or notes and details that explain where we can find more specific information. Okay, now I'm going to wrap up this whole webinar with some best practices to consider for the JPA and with correction requests. So the big ones are definitely to utilize the checklist and utilize the instructions. The screenshot on this slide is showing the help boxes that appear if you hover over the question. The administrative completeness checklist is designed to help both internal staff review the JPA and is designed to help external applicants understand some of the more nuanced questions. So our goal is to have staff conducting completeness review within 1 week of receiving an application or receiving your responses to the CRs. Staff will try to include everything in their first round of CRs. Eagle policy is to the extent practicable, identify all completeness issues the first time around for the applicant so that it isn't a moving target. On the flip side of that, the responses by the applicant should also address all aspects of the correction request at one time. So if there were multiple items or questions, address each of them and answer every question, or else the correction request will likely be reopened. But be as clear as possible and provide Eagle with information on what you modified or corrected in the JPA. Eagle staff will try to provide explicit instructions on what needs to be corrected. Staff will try to give you specific pages and locations on where items are missing or need to be corrected, but it is helpful if in your responses the applicant also informs Eagle staff where those changes were made. And finally, maintain open communication with Eagle staff and utilize those pre-application meetings to discuss what items should be included. So applicants do have a couple of options for Eagle assistance when it comes to planning a project, essentially for improving communication and coordination with each other, as well as smoothing the permit process and administrative completeness review. So Eagle offers the Wetland Identification Program. This is a delineation provided by Eagle for projects up to 5 acres in size or confirmation of a consultant's delineation. Pre-application meetings are also available to request an on-site meeting or an in-office or virtual meeting for a small fee to discuss the project and determine if a permit will be needed. This differs from the WIP in that it's more discussion-based, but during a pre-app, staff can determine if wetlands are present in the project area and whether a permit is required, but staff will not delineate the wetland or confirm wetland boundaries in the pre-app. So I know I touched on this a lot in other webinars and throughout this training, but I really can't stress the importance of pre-application meetings enough, especially for these large, complicated projects. So aside from just calling the permit processor, this is the best way to establish expectations for the project, to clearly communicate how the applications should be submitted, what sections should be completed. I personally find it very helpful when a consultant uses that opportunity to ask about how to complete the JPA, what sections should they fill out, how to communicate the nuanced information so we can document that, follow up with an email, get on the same page, and process it smoothly. But I do recommend submitting that request as early as possible in the planning process prior to submitting a permit application. Ideally, it's at a good development stage that we can have preliminary information where you can include as much as you can, but early enough that if we're discussing modifications or action items, that those can be done with enough time for you to submit a permit application. The more information provided in a pre-app request, the better prepared Eagle staff can be, and then the more productive the meeting. So a few key items to provide info on all the water resources potentially impacted by the proposed project, any preliminary plan designs or wetland delineations, and your project purpose. Also beneficial, tell Eagle staff what you want to get out of the meeting. Are you looking for an answer to a specific question, or do you want to make sure Eagle staff touch on certain topics? So Eagle staff should be doing a preliminary review of the project area anyway in preparation for your meeting, but sometimes the pre-app meeting request is very vague that we're not sure what the project is or how best to help you. So providing that information will also help us inform us if we think there are specific discussions that need to be had, like mitigation, red file, restoration, etc. And then from a timing perspective, keep in mind that the time of year and type of request can impact how quickly the meeting can be scheduled. Virtual visits are great because they can be easier and quicker to schedule, but if we need to agree on a bank full call, or confirm regulatory jurisdiction, or agree on the ordinary high watermark, then an on-site visit would be necessary for Eagle staff to provide specific guidance. And wetland determinations are very difficult in winter. So if there's a foot of snow on the ground, we often will not be able to make a determination until spring. Our website has a lot of different help documents as it pertains to MiEnviro, the JPA, the permit category. So please check out michigan.gov/joint permit, and you'll also find FAQs. There's a flow chart showing the overall permit process, sample drawings, specific project assistance and guidance, and then links to other programs and helpful materials. So hopefully, I was able to provide some clarification and good information on specific issues or questions with the JPA. I'm sure there's plenty more questions, but I do want to acknowledge and recognize that there are going to be complicated files and situations that don't fit the JPA perfectly. But in those situations, communication with Eagle, communication with your local district permit processor is really key. So definitely reach out with questions, take advantage of the pre-application meetings, provide follow-up, provide clear details, and Eagle will strive to provide good communication to you all as well. And that is it for me. We did it.
Wow, impressive. Certainly advanced. So I'm glad we clarified that in our email prior to this. So if anybody has questions, they can type it in to the Q&A. And Amy and Ann, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, we've been trying to answer things that come in the Q&A that are more specific throughout the presentation. But we did get a question here in the last minute. I don't know if you see it, Kate, but it says, can you talk about how and when T&E review or coordination documents with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or MDNR needs to be provided?
Okay, yeah. So some items are required for completeness for T&E review. So like, for example, the D key on larger projects is a required part of the JPA. And so that would need to be provided early on. And I always just recommend to applicants in general to start that process, to reach out to Fish and Wildlife Service, to reach out to DNR early on, pretty much when you start coordinating with us for pre-application meetings, so that you have that information either for the pre-application meeting or just well ahead of your permit submission. So yeah, I think that would be my basic answer.
Thanks, Kate. Does anybody else have any questions? Let's see here. Okay, next question, Kate. What is the best way for an applicant to know when Eagle has determined the JPA is administratively complete and also technically complete? If you want, I can answer that, but I think you can.
Well, I mean, there should be a notification to the I guess the notification recipient of the JPA, typically the applicant, when an application is marked complete. So you should get an automated email from MiEnviro on when the application is actually deemed administratively complete. Is that what you were going to say?
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. So there is no real thing as technically complete. I know our staff sometimes talk about how a lot of the permit review comes after administrative completeness, but there is no milestone for technically complete. It's broken up into administrative completeness, and then it goes into basically the permit review. And the next milestone is issue, deny, or modify. Do you have anything to add to that, Kate?
No.
Okay.
I would say I'm not sure that they do get a email. So
really,
you guys might look into that. I don't think I've ever seen that. I mean, so somebody actually somewhere clicks complete. This file complete.
We put a date in basically, Todd. I thought the applicant was getting notification. I'm not sure about the agents.
Yeah, so the notifications in MiEnviro, if you are not selecting yourself or anybody you want to receive emails as a notification recipient, then you won't get the automated email. So when you are completing the application in MiEnviro, you have to, in your contact list, mark whoever you want to get the emails as a notification recipient.
Yeah, and Ann just chimed in here and said that you might not get a specific thing about the administrative completeness, but you should get a status change. So if you're on the notifications, you should be getting a status change.
Okay.
We will look into it, Todd. We will test it out for you.
Yeah, I don't want to debate this in front of everybody, but you know me. I'm not sure that's true. So let's look into that a little bit.
Well, Brianna disagrees with you. Oh, we got.
Okay. Yeah, and Brian agrees with me. So there you
go. Okay. We will look into it.
Perfect.
That's great. Love it.
Okay. Any other questions? We can give a few more seconds here. Very impressive, Kate. A lot of information. So we'll have this recording completed and put on the MWA website here soon so people can send it around to all their friends. I'm sure everybody wants to listen to it again. So I appreciate everybody's time, and thank you again, Kate.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.